Welcome to episode 5 of the My New Normal podcast. I am your host, Dr. Teresa Larson. I have a very special guest on today, Dr. Kelly Starrett. Now, my father used to tell me growing up, if you want to do something, whatever you want to do, find someone who's doing it really well, find them, stalk them in a healthy way, and meet them. So I did just that. I met Kelly Starrett so my gunnery sergeant from the Marine Corps told me about him, went up to San Francisco, to the parking lot of dreams, to the Connex box where PT magic was done, and just got to know a guy who's doing something different. And I needed to see it. And I craved doing something different, what's not being done, and giving people what they need, which is basically tools on how to take ownership of their health. A lot of these tools can be very simple, but in terms of self-maintenance, Dr. Kelly started a revolution of teaching people how to not just wait for a doctor to tell them to start foam rolling, using heat, working on soft tissue, working on joints, but he challenged them to start doing it immediately on their own and showing them actually methods to do that. And I got a chance to, after meeting him, to start teaching his movement and mobility course through CrossFit. And then I designed my own course, the functional training for the adaptive athlete, because I actually didn't want to keep traveling all over the place and working just for an organization that solely wanted me to stay within that realm, but like be able to expand to any governing body of strength and conditioning, anyone who wanted to listen. I am here to talk about adaptive strength and conditioning, and Kelly Starrett was kind enough to let me host our online course, Max Conserva and mine, on his platform. So it's pretty cool. I hope that if any of you coaches out there listening or people who do have adaptive needs, check out that course. We'll provide a link that you can get to from my personal website, Dr. Teresa Larson, as well as Mobility Wide. But Kelly Starrett, one, has been a friend of mine, a mentor, and someone who I just find, he's a mover and a shaker in our industry, and has written 5 books now, just put out one called Waterman 2.0, has a podcast himself with his lovely wife, Juliet, called The Ready State, and is just doing some amazing things. So please check out his stuff and enjoy this interview because it's a fun one. And there's lots of good tools you can take away right now, wherever on the spectrum of athlete adaptive needs you are. We're all adaptive, but if you've undergone a permanent injury where you're now learning this new space you're in, or you've undergone a loss, or you have a temporary injury, these things that we talk about on here can apply to you. All right, with that, enjoy. Another episode of the My New Normal podcast. I am super stoked to have my friend Kelly Starrett here, who is also a mentor to me, and good friend as well. And just so you guys have all just listened to the intro of this and how we met, but the last year of PT school I met Kelly. I found out about him through my gunnery sergeant from the Marine Corps and went up to visit him. He took me aside and kind of put a stone in my shoe to be the PT to make a change in the medical industry, just like he is doing. And because the way the direction I thought I would be going wasn't really empowering for me. And it took, that was a really poignant time in my life that caused me to create a change in my life in the direction I'm going now with my PT career, which is really awesome. So Kelly, excited to have you here.
Super major pleasure. I remember that walk. We were at Chrissy Field,
Yes.
Going for a walk. Your gunnery sergeant obviously was the most smart person on the planet. And
Yes.
And I'll just say straight up, game recognizes game all the time. You had so much game. If I had 2 skills, I have one is I'm really good at pattern recognition. And maybe 3 skills, I can eat cookies like no one's business. And the third skill is I can recognize talent, and you're just dripping talent. So easy grab, low hanging fruit there for me.
Well, it's been It's been, I think, 7 years since I met you, and it's been quite a ride. So I want to dive right into this thing because you are a mover and a shaker and have revolutionized sports medicine, medicine in general, getting people to take care of themselves. And we're going to dive into that. However, I want to know, I've been very fascinated with leaders and their journey, and how they've gotten to where they are, because it hasn't come without some struggle and some forced change. But first, an icebreaker. I want to know what your favorite, maybe most embarrassing experience in PT school was.
Oh man, dude, I was the black sheep in PT school. I asked all
So
the
was
tough
I.
questions. And I really saw the truth of what I was learning, but really, super struggling to reconcile it all. Because the way I had experienced myself as an athlete, an injured athlete, and what I was learning about in terms of the tenets of strength conditioning, and early CrossFit. I discovered CrossFit in my first semester of PT school,
Okay.
and there were only 5 CrossFits. And Greg Glassman was riding every day, and suddenly I was like, wow, I don't know really much about powerlifting. I don't know anything about Olympic lifting. I'd done a little bit of Olympic lifting. I was already Olympic lifting with Jim Schmitz in the city. My gymnastics, I was sucky. I mean, I thought I was a good athlete, and it turned out I wasn't conditioned. I just didn't know anything. I didn't know how to run. I didn't know, and I was like, wow, I'm a really good athlete. I've been a national champion, and I am a beginner at all this. So really trying to reconcile those things, struggle. I had a lot of dissonance between sort of the tradition that I was being fed and understanding the way the real world worked. The worst moment, there are a lot of good moments in PT school where I'd like to take them back, but because I was a boater and a surfer, I didn't wear underwear a lot. I just wore board shorts. And
Mando style.
yeah, which is, it's sanitary and you just dry and you can't walk around with wet undies all the time. And oftentimes I would squeak out these workouts at lunch and whatever. And so I put a friend on my shoulder and I was overhead squatting him. We're just squatting the shorts, full blowout, huge. And then I had a huge presentation 30 seconds later in front of the entire staff and entire PT department. And I literally tied a friend's sweater around my waist. I was like, I got this. It's fine. Can you see my balls? We're okay. And so I went up and I presented with these blown out shorts. Obviously it was informal because I was in shorts, but with just my friend's sweater tied around my waist. And literally the whole time I was like, this could be the greatest moment of my life or the worst moment of my life. So, that reminds in my head that, no one is too good for a good, pant blowout, and the show must go on.
I like it. I like the fact that you could transition so quickly. I mean, that was key. Just go ahead and think about it. All right.
What do they say? Like, what is it you can do when you can do nothing? Well, if the world doesn't fit, you make it fit. So
That's right.
I was really glad that someone had a sweater there, and I was just even freer, more commando than I normally was.
Well, have you ever seen those Marine Corps silkies? I'm sure.
Yeah. In fact, I think that is technically the regulation pant length for every man on the planet. And, if I had a choice, I would say, like, why aren't we all in that
Silkies?
length short? Well, Ranger panties, silkies,
Right.
whatever you want to call them, it turns out that you actually don't put on an exoskeleton that limits your range of motion. We should be opening up a range of motion, just saying,
And you don't need underwear. So people don't have to worry about it. Well, my favorite experience in PT school was, I had many ups and downs, but I would have to say that going to Austria. So I happened to get an internship in Austria. It was really hard. I didn't learn much manual therapy, but I definitely learned how to snowboard. So
there you go.
Pulled a sheet over everyone's eyes on that one. People are like, how
well done.
Austria?
How did you do that? Yeah, I did not have that same PT school experience, but it's interesting because at the heart of this conversation is the notion that the world is not set, and that what we should be thinking about is we have these traditions of knowledge which should be dynamic and fluid and adapting to the world and to the people that we're seeing. And what we need to do is understand what set of problems people were trying to solve, and then look around and say, how do we make this better? Even Chris Powers, who was the president of the CAPTA and such a giant in our industry, who said, look, if you're following the Practice Act as a physical therapist, you're actually not a good physical therapist because you're not innovating. You're not thinking about, so it's vital that we have touchstone moments of saying, hey, here's what we think is best practice currently. Here's how we're going to help the most people in the most amount of time. But then we need to see, is there slack that can be taken on the system? Can we think differently? And so much of what I was doing at the time was, again, realizing that there was a lot to be garnered as a physical therapist from our strength conditioning brothers and sisters. For example, in physiotherapy, there's an old model that didn't even come in physiotherapy, was adapted from somewhere else, but it's this biopsychosocial model, which really says that human beings aren't just blind mechanical systems. Instead, there's a lot of arousal and psychosocial components. And are you having sex, a loving relationship? Do you get sun? Do you move around your day? What's your food look like? How stressed you are? I mean, for an example, right now we're seeing that the chances of you being a diabetic, developing diabetes as an adult is 2 out of 3 if you're a Latino male or an Afro-American woman. And what you would be making a huge mistake on if you were talking about an African-American woman is not understanding background stress about being a woman of color and her interaction with the world and the background stress and the cost of that stress on the organism. So what's important is that we're always thinking about the person in the context of their life and the context of society. And I didn't learn that in physical therapy school. I learned that because that was about coaching, and that if we had to get athletes to perform, they had to feel loved, they had to feel supported, we had to manage sleep, we had to look at food, we had to look at, roles. And that was my own example, paddling on the World Cup. And so, when I hear people say that, hey, we don't talk about pain enough, we talk about pain every day in the gym because we are at the tip of the spear. So we're not waiting around for someone to have some crippling pathology or crippling, mechanical dysfunction or disuse, misuse, abuse, whatever the language you want to use, so that they can't occupy their role in society, they can't do their job, they can't do their work. Instead, man, I am where the rubber hits the road every day and always having this conversation. And so for me, I have to say that, what I realized strength conditioning brought was a lot of clarity because it was about performance and about sort of simplifying these complex systems. And I started to apply that early on to my thinking. And here's an example. We had an incredible neurologic rehab program at our school, and I had a woman, so we had patients who would come in and subject themselves to, hours and hours of really bumbling student care. They were so patient with us and great, and we were so careful and caring. And I mean, you couldn't get this kind of level of detail, like 3 little, people hovering around you. But a lot of times we'd see people who were, sitting predominantly in a chair, for example, and no one thought about them as a mechanical system. They only thought them as a neurologic, issue that, they were status post-traumatic brain injury, or they'd had a cerebrovascular accident. And no one said, well, hey, if you sit all the time, the anterior hip structures get short, and that affects your ability to breathe or your pelvic floor. And so a lot of my interventions had some kind of positional challenge, not just balance or scooting or function. It was about restoration of indigenous and native mechanics. And that really made the rest of the students uncomfortable. And I was like, hey, look, she still has knees. She still has quadriceps. And if you want her to get off the ground, we're going to have to, work on these things beyond just training the system. Balance works, but if you have a system that is restricted and stiff and doesn't have input, and then of course, what we're finding now is, man, we're seeing that people just don't have enough input. And so one of the things that, I come to realize a lot of is that, who's responsible for the care and feeding of the human being, and some of the things we figured out were that intra-session change was way more important than inter-session change. That the change I make during our visits is really important. Trust, belief effects. There are some things that a physio or a professional can help you or teach you, but it's your ability to carry those things between sessions that matters. And suddenly I'm working in Kaiser, and I can do an eval. Takes someone 3 weeks to see me, and then I can only see him 10 days later for the follow-up. What's going to happen between that first visit and 10 days later and then another 10 days? So you've seen me for a total of 2 hours. or 45 minutes and a half hour. And it's been 6 weeks, So, it really made me think critically about, who's responsible, and are the things that we're doing as physical therapists, are they truly skilled care, or does this belong in the toolbox of every human being? And that really started to drive and shift for me that loci of control back to the person. And,
So,
here's another example. Some physical therapists put on the internet, they're like, what about the Theragun? Oh, I never use a Theragun. Theraguns are dumb. Theragun, blah, blah. And I was like, my response, because I got tagged in that, was like, anything that empowers my people to be able to desensitize, get them reperfuse, make someone feel better, that doesn't involve a medical professional between them and an action, is absolutely about. And so that changes how you think about the world.
So that's a good, so when I was teaching your courses and teaching the pain section, just helping the people understand pain, we, 96% of injuries are preventable. And then there's the 4%, right, that are traumatic. And I found, so I agree. And that's something I've seen you, Kelly, treat people anywhere from an adaptive athlete to a mom to, a basketball player, professional basketball player, the same. You treat everyone the same. And you teach people to perform maintenance on their bodies. Like, they are responsible to keep themselves healthy and to stay ahead of the curve, and to continue learning. And you're there to empower them as a therapist. In the adaptive world, I've found, because these are the 4% that have these injuries, that they're not preventing a lot of them. It's like an accident, that motorcycle, snowboard, maybe decisions that, could have been prevented, but no, like, they were out there getting after it in life and shit happened. And they go into a medical system where they are fed with, what's wrong with you? This is what's wrong with you. This is what you can't do anymore. This is what you can't do. And so a lot of them come to me, and even Max Conserva has shared this with me, and they're like, okay, well, what's next now? I feel scared to do anything because my doctor said I would never ski again, or fitness, I should just be doing PT as my fitness. And it's like, well, no, it's been a couple years, it's been a year, whatever, since your injury. Like, you're a human being. There's so much that you can do. And
and sometimes giving permission back. Juliet says, sometimes she's like, I know you. She's like, my wife says, like, look, I know you're a good physical therapist. But she's like, but probably 90% of the magic can be done by any other physical therapist. But you really feel comfortable with the boundaries of getting people to believe in themselves and to have the belief effects and all the associated psychology and permission to explore this together. And I can be your guide and we can work together, but this is on you. And we're all going to be 100 years old. And the real question is, if I put a medical professional between you and some activity, is that sustainable for a long time? We look, good physio coach, that physio coach model is a relationship I want you to have for the rest of your life. When something pops up or you can't solve it, then you go see an expert. And the rest of the time, get the expert out of your room. And there's a time in this acute phase where, hey, we need to let this tissues heal and we need to load you appropriately. And otherwise you're going to just muck it up. And if you just tore your ACL, do not try to fix that yourself on the internet. Go get some help and then become an ACL expert, as you do this. And I think you're right around that. Something that really was important in physio school is the first week I met with my advisor, and she was, heavy manual therapist, had a long-term course herself. She was just, I caught my physio school at a bump where it was just, there were so many good therapists and instructors, like the head of Kaiser Vallejo was one of my daily instructors. That's the World Center for PNF, one of the senior instructors. So I got to interact with Steve Schmidt so many times, and it's so formative, and it's thinking about chronic pain and neural dynamics. But I met with this woman, and she's like, well, what do you want to do? And I kind of told her what I'm currently doing. This is what I want to do. And she was like, oh, no, you don't. Like, you don't know what you want to do. And she read me the riot act and really dressed me down. In a place where I walked out there and I was like, what the hell was that? And I was like, okay, noted. I will keep my cards close to my chest and I will fool all these people. And when I went through finished a really aggressive, beefy neurologic rehab, we really, our school was primed, excellent for that. And that wasn't what my love was, but I saw how much I could garner from that. And the instructors pulled me aside and they're like, Kelly, you really have a talent for neurologic rehab. They're like, we just never seen this before. And we love how passionate you are. And I was like, I hate this. Like, this is not what I'm doing. Like, you thought I was going to do this? And they were like, what? And I was like, this Sluzars told me not to ever tell you guys what I'm doing. What I'm saying is, though, we have to become better generalists as human beings, and that you don't have the right to be a specialist in the way that you're the fundamentals of being a human. You need to be an expert in your own sleep. You need to have some education around foods that make you feel better and foods that are sustainable. You need to figure out what a sustainable movement practice is. When something hurts or is sensitized or is stiff, you need a plan. And if that felt disruptive 10 years ago, it's no longer disruptive.
Right.
We needed to shift a lot of the burden of care out of the physio back into the person. And that was really our central model. I needed to be a generalist. I need to be able to talk to your mom, talk to the person who's had radio frequency ablation and is on morphine and trying to manage their chronic pain. Right. And I need to be an expert at being able to go up to the NFL. And it doesn't mean that I have to be all things to all people, but if your skill set doesn't transfer, if you can't see the connections, and once again, I took this from Olympic lifting. One of my senseis is a guy named Mike Bergner, who is, Coach B to us all. And Mike had children who were Olympians in Olympic lifting, and he was an Olympic coach, and he's just a senior master's badass and a Marine. And what I'll tell you is that when I first met him, he was coaching high school still. And part of his daily practice was to teach 14-year-old boys and 14-year-old girls how to snatch and how to Olympic lift. And what I saw was he had a skill set that was contiguous from teaching children all the way to Olympians, and that there was stepwise through. And so that his language could be spun up and spun down, but that there was core thinking all the way through, and that they weren't disparate pockets, but a unified, integrated whole around teaching human movement. And for me, I was like, can I do that as a physical therapist? Can I do that as a coach? And that really set a high bar for me to be able to understand that, hey, I might not be an expert, I might have to get some help, but there's some things I can do today that are in my core skill set.
So you hit on a great point there. As coaches, I want more coaches to be involved in working with adaptive athletes. I want more physios to be coaching individuals as well as adaptive athletes. But being a generalist and being able to look at someone and not just look at, what their movement is, but how are they sleeping? How are they eating? What makes them happy? What causes them stress? What are some stressors in their life? What is their athletic background like? And being able to understand too, like what I really love about the adaptive population is they come in, and most of the time when they come into the gym, they're super motivated. They're like, okay, this is scary for me, but I'm ready to learn something. And
you catch right. People, what makes people change behavior? And, as a young physio student, I watched a really successful attorney have 4 coronary artery bypass grafts put in. And, he was overweight, drinker, has every resource available to him, very wealthy man, 4 kids, loving wife. And I was like, it's so hard for him to change his behavior because what he's done has worked and coped to the place that allowed him to be a successful attorney, have 4 kids that love him, and be in a loving relationship with his wife. And yet, if you ran that experiment long enough, his heart dies. So something is wrong. And he clearly knew that he had a weight problem and pre-diabetic problem, right? And an insulin control problem. And this wasn't a surprise to him. And there's a human being who is highly motivated and yet has all of the tools possible and still can't make the change, I was like, it must be really difficult. And I didn't walk away and say, shame on him. I walked around saying, shame on us for recognizing and failure to recognize how difficult it is to change behavior and to get people's consciousness changed and open. And what's really incredible, I'm really proud of the adaptive athletic population and program we have at our gym. We're tied to UCSF. There's physios involved. Max, your business partner is he's incredible, and he ties our coaches in, and really he's the safe space. Like, well, Max trusts me, and we all trust each other, and we can begin this conversation. But you have as athletes and people who come in, and the bar has been set really low for them. So when you change that at all, they're shocked. And secondarily, there's a change. There's a transitional consciousness change where people are realizing you've got their attention because they're in a chair or their leg is no longer there or they've had it. I mean, you've got them. And usually we have to wait for an athlete to lose a world championship, fail, get injured, not be able to do their job. And so what's interesting about this adaptive population or an athlete working around a problem, that's to some degree all of us. The difference is the severity only, or the significance of the population change, or the adaptation change, and that we actually have people who are willing to buy in versus, hey, I'm diabetic, or I don't sleep, or I have all these chronic health problems, or hey, I have a hole in my knee. It's a scope and a spectrum, And I think what's interesting is that when you look at it again, physical therapist, is the physio the place to be getting your rehab training? Well, yeah, immediately acute. Yes, it is. But then it's not, because no one gets paid to have a conversation about your sleep or loving relationship. That is your stress or your movement. Right. That's a conversation that happens not in a hospital.
Right. That happens with a coach. That can happen with a coach. And the coach, like I see, is the first line of defense for these athletes. Like, they should be asking those questions, some of the harder questions, especially when they develop a rapport. And I find I've learned a ton from the adaptive athletes, the athletes I've worked with, about just things to think about as a coach. Like, if most of the guys that come in and gals, they come in after a weekend of training and doing wheelchair basketball tournaments and or Spartan races now. And it's like, okay, well, what was your recovery like after? What was your sleep like? That's going to determine how we train today. And what's really cool is whether you're a mom who injured her ACL and is, 6 months after rehab, or you're an adaptive athlete post motorcycle accident with a traumatic brain injury and you're in a chair, you can still do you can still do maintenance on your body. And I think for the mom, it's like, okay, maybe she got some of that from, or the dad, maybe they got that from a PT. But in the adaptive world, I find this concept of self-maintenance, Kelly, is still a little foreign. It's like, oh my gosh, I can work on my chronic pain in my mid back by myself. Like, I don't need.
I can desensitize, we can think about it this way. It's just input. It's a different form of proprioceptive mechanic input. We know the cellular level, the phrase in vogue is mechanotransduction, which means you have to have physical loading of tissues in order for those tissues to express themselves correctly. Ergo, I just saw a post on some really thoughtful physio site, and they were talking about something they'd seen, and it was like the role of isometrics in rehab. And I was like, well, if you don't do isometrics, you're actually missing a third of what tendons do. Tendons have to accelerate, they have to decelerate, right? And they have to stop and hold position. And so are you rehabbing someone to return function by making sure that at least you're touching what the body does? And one of the ways that we're able to sneak in and change the body map, get blood flow into things, is this rolling around on a ball, or rolling around, or grabbing a Theragun, or doing some kind of proprioceptive input or awareness, or just upregulating the system. And I suspect that there's a lot of, mild, fibral pain symptoms that are really just a lack of input, and a lot of neuropathies. And what we're seeing is, we're moving away from being cold, we're moving away from being hot, we're not uncomfortable. You should be fidgeting. People don't understand that 10,000 steps a day is the FDA. Let's just say that you're an able-bodied person who can do that, right? So if you're unable to take this 10,000 steps, you're listening to this, what we were saying is you've got to move a whole bunch.
Right.
and you've got to move your body. And if you don't hit that threshold, you won't be tired enough. You won't decongest the body. That's our FDA limited RDA, for lack of a better word. So you don't get rickets or scurvy. So that's the baseline. And what we're seeing is that most of us, for not on our own or self-decision, but because our environment and our culture has guided us into these positions where the world gets really small very quickly, and we're not moving and we're not doing the things human beings should move. And in our tier 1 military groups we work with, when we're trying to unravel sleep, one of the things that we know is, hey, but you're stressed, and did you drink, how much caffeine did you have after 4, and how much alcohol did you have before you go to bed, and how did you self-medicate that stress? Well, here's one things we can track. Let's actually see how much sleep you're getting, so we actually know. And 2, did you move around enough during the day? And one of the first interventions we have at high-level populations is to do a little bit more walking or rhythmic exercise or moving. And that could be swimming, that could be going out for a long roll on your chair. It could be a lot of things that are appropriate. It could be standing on a vibration plate, just putting some input into the body. And I think when we come back to first principles, it turns out it doesn't matter if you're missing a knee or something has happened, or you still have the principles that make us human. You're going to have to eat a certain way. You're going to have to get ahead of how well and densely you're sleeping. You're going to have to be in relationships and in a community. And, and suddenly, what you see is that we all have a lot more in common than, we have not in common.
Oh, yeah. 1 second. Wow. With the adaptive population, I found that one of the things that's really helped them, and I've kind of started to work, because now I'm working with more companies, Kelly, and trying to just get people, not come in as necessarily motivating them, but showing them how to change their behaviors. Right. And
that's the thing.
And because I could do all of it's like I could, take them one-on-one and do all this awesome stuff to them, but it doesn't do shit unless they're actively applying some of these principles we're talking about to their life. And I found I've been very fascinated. And even with the adaptive population, it's I could work with you one-on-one, but you've already done a year of rehab. Let's actually teach you these things you can do at home and empower you to start taking ownership of your health. And is outside the gym. It's outside. It's at the office. It's what you do outside of wheelchair basketball sessions. And a lot of the guys, sometimes the complaint is, I don't have the motivation, or man, I'm overweight and it's just going to take me a lot of time. I mean, this happens on the adaptive end and everyone's adaptive, but the spectrum, it happens across the spectrum. And I'm all you have to do, and this is stuff I've studied on trauma and what trauma does to the cells. The way you change that is through taking action. And taking action, don't wait for motivation. Just put yourself in a situation to challenge your body. And that could be taking a tool to work on your chronic pain, right? Taking a tool to your mid-back. It could be going into a gym and doing some movement with a coach, or just doing something with your body. If you're a wheelchair athlete, you should be able to do at least 30 dips, right? Because that means that you can transfer from surface to surface easier.
Or thinking about developing these capacities over a lifetime, right? Improving our skills. Sorry, there was some jackhammering in the hall. I had to move. But I really appreciate the notion of, one of my old mates is a guy named Kyle Maynard. And Kyle is famous. We've seen him on Nike ads. He's climbed Kilimanjaro. And he, he doesn't have arms and legs. He has some residual arms and legs. And, he's been to Oprah twice. He's a stud and very handsome, too smart for his own good. And, he was in one early course I was teaching, and I was like, dude, your hips suck. I mean, he deadlifts and he's done MMA. But I was like, what are you doing? Why are your hips so? He's like, what are you talking about? And no one had treated him as a biopsychosocial, mechanical person. And, giving him some tools to establish what we think are acceptable ranges, acceptable functions, and improving those things is really what this conversation is. And that's going to be different. And those boundaries are the same way that, hey, my mom does an Olympic lift, but my mom does deadlift, and she breathes hard, and she does Turkish
Right.
get-ups, right? But she doesn't snatch, right?
Right.
My mom is 73, and having appropriate guidelines for her to work hard, you know. And then again, we're coming back to just first principles. You've got to breathe hard. You've got to be under some load. You've got to maintain your positions and capacities. And, you know, hopefully you're in a community that supports that. And if you're not, let's begin by simplifying the system. You know, let's get you in a community of like-minded people so that you don't have to do the whole thing. Jocko Willink, you know, people know as Jocko. And what I'll say about Jocko makes, and I'm a big fan. And one of the things that he says that I think really resonates with me, he says, discipline is freedom. And I don't necessarily think it's discipline. What I think is habit is freedom. Practice is freedom.
Right.
And his point around discipline is that if you're disciplined, then you don't have to rely on inspiration or motivation to get you there, because I'm going to the gym on Tuesday because everyone's there, or I'll be at a walk here. And when you begin to constrain the environment for you to make the right decisions, that means that if I don't want to eat cookies at night, I don't buy cookies. Otherwise, I'll wake up in the middle of the night and eat all the cookies, right? So I just don't have cookies in the house.
Right.
If I know I need to walk more, then I'll set dates to walk with my friends, or create a plan where I don't have to make a decision and overcome all the other, make another choice when I have so much choice fatigue. Instead, I'll just go ahead and do the right thing because I've already set up the environment. And when you begin to see that as a behavior hack or change, or an agency for change, then all of a sudden you can begin to apply the same model to a lot of different aspects of your life. And unfortunately, you don't.
Right.
I wish you needed to train like an Olympic athlete. You don't. But there are some fundamentals that are endemic to every human being, and we're not doing a good job on those.
So the other component to just physical, we're creating physical well-being in people, and they need to take ownership of their health, apply the tools they're learning from individuals like yourself, myself, and hopefully they're physios and coaches. The other component to this, though, that's really cool, is that the mental health also improves, right? Like, it's people want to get in shape. They want to lose weight. And actually, I think I read this on, you guys have a nonprofit, Stand Up Kids. And it was, people are more motivated to lose weight than the fact that they're going to die if they keep sitting. It was like, okay, so people are motivated by weight loss. People are motivated by getting fit. But the other thing is, 1 in 4 Americans have depression in our country. A lot of the adaptive athletes I work with have had mild traumatic brain injuries or more severe, and also have comorbidities of depression and anxiety. It's very common. We live in a kind of a stressed out, want to be comfortable culture. And so what I have found, and through the research I've done too, is this idea of self-maintenance and just taking care of the basics. Like, are you in a loving relationship? Sleep. Are you moving every day and stressing your body? Are you breathing? Are you doing some deep breath practices to like calm your physiology? Those things will improve your mental health. Like, exercise, movement, self-maintenance is the key prescription for mental health conditions.
Yeah, and I appreciate you saying this, because when we look at the complexity of that is the human being, there's never going to be a strand that we pull out and it's the one strand, right? Instead, we say, okay, there's a lot of impacts and a lot of things, and people are under a lot of varied stresses. But we have a friend whose son just came home from boarding school and is being treated for clinical depression. And the first thing that UCSF asked him was, tell us about your sleep. And it turns out this kid was going to bed at 3 or 4 in the morning, 2 and 3 or 4 in the morning, because he had his phone and texting his sexy girlfriend and just, being distracted and being away. And then he'd get up at 5:30. And he did that for months and months and months. And then, you start to, well, we can't even tell what's what until we get ahead. So what I think is great is we tell people, like, look, it's test, retest. I'm going to just say, don't believe that you'll feel better, but go ahead and prove me wrong. Get a little sunshine in your body, go ahead and just get a little walk in or roll or whatever it is you need to do, or swim or pull or whatever the thing that you're moving. Then get us the best sleep that's available to you tonight. Get off the caffeine at 4. Don't drink alcohol. Don't use the THC to downregulate. Let's do some soft tissue work, and let's see if we can feel better, a little bit better the next day. And what we realize is that there's a lot to unpack around this notion of depression and feeling and belonging. And when you read Sebastian Junger's book, Tribe,
Good one.
you know, I think it's really powerful to understand that the role of human beings are not solitary animals. You
Right.
know, what do they say? If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go with friends, you know? And
Right.
I think that's really the model, is that we are tribal animals and collective animals. And it's very easy with Facebook and tech and the fence I have that I'm never now around people. And that's an adaptation error, and depression can be an adaptation error around that. So, you know, if you get happy, you smile, but when you start to smile, you'll also feel happy.
Right.
And so I don't care what the input in is. If you can get in some great cognitive behavioral therapy and get in a group and be in a loving relationship, great. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and control what we can control,
Right.
and level up what we can level up. And that also begins to shift low self-control back to us.
And I think for myself, it's been empowering to know that I have a lot of control over my mental health and my physical health. I mean, I've known the physical for a long time, and I've learned a ton from working with you and teaching your course. And then just now, like, working on the adaptive movement and educating coaches. But the mental health component, because you can't see it, it's invisible, is like, oh God, like, I'm super moody. I've got these triggers. It can be very overwhelming because the brain there's a lot of things going on that control different aspects of how we experience our environment. And but I've learned, like, through just simple things like being part of a tribe. Like, I needed to find my tribe post Marine Corps, and I didn't find that. And the adaptive community is that tribe for me. My
That's
company
right.
and this physical therapy unit, like you've created, Kelly, too, is a tribe for me. There's can be different ones. That's helped me a ton. And the other thing is, like, working on my body, like working on the down regulation and realizing, holy crap, like my brain isn't going out of control because I'm now doing work physically on my body, but my mind feels better. Like,
That's
it's
right.
really cool to finally connect that.
And that's what, it's really N of 1, and it's like test, retest, test, retest, test, retest. You'll become like an anecdotal empiricist. I mean, like, you're an N of 1.
Right.
That's all that matters. And
Yes.
there is good science to understand how these things work and input. On our little podcast, The Ready State, we talk with Andrew Huberman, who is a neuroscientist at Stanford, and talking about sometimes physical input is more effective than cognitive top-down processing. It's easier, right? The brain and body are a single unit. And it's not an accident. If we come back even to our oldest yoga traditions, Iyengar said famously, the breath is king of the brain and nerves are king of the breath.
Mm-hmm.
And when we can begin to untangle some of these complexity issues around how I feel and my state, when I just begin to have the appropriate inputs. And here's a real life story. I have a 13-year-old girl who literally is a maniac, right? And Georgia Starrett is one of the greatest kids on the planet, but she's also a lioness, going through transition. And there are, sometimes I'm like, wow, there's a movie out right now that just, with Tom Hardy, right, where like the symbiote comes into Venom, it takes him over,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a moment where the symbiotic creature snaps back, and Tom Hardy's sort of stuck in there, wild-eyed, and I'm like, oh, that's allegory for having a 13-year-old girl in your house or a teenager. And what do? We give her tools to downregulate. She comes home from water polo practice, which crushes her. And then we go right to the hot tub, and I don't ask her questions. I'm just chill out with her.
Mm-hmm.
We make sure we control her sleep. She's fed enough. She's moving enough. And then those peaks and valleys and spikes, which are totally normal and reasonable,
Right.
are just sort of chopped off a little bit, and
Right.
that it's okay for us not to be shiny, happy people, don't lie and say that your sleep is sorted and you're watching Netflix till 2 a.m. and on some kind of alcohol depressant stimulant cycle, because
Right.
you can't feel the edge. And I understand that ultimately we're trying to get people back to feeling comfortable feeling again. And maybe that's just the rolling around on a ball or a foam roller or having some input or non-sexual massage touch. Those things are the same thing as feeling.
Right. And I think thank you for sharing that. I have a little 1.5-year-old who's going to be a teenager one day. We're going to go through all of it.
And have no idea how bad his feet are going to stink. You're going to be shocked.
Well, he already has some stinkiness to him being a little boy. The multiple diaper changes a day. And he's still addicted to a binky, but that's very soothing for him right now. So we give him that at night because it's soothing.
Well, I think that's what you're really seeing is that a lot of the behaviors, we divide everything into very quickly, like, is this central nervous system positive or a negative? Is it a stress or not? So people are like, what about alcohol? I'm like, well, we see it as a stressor to the central nervous system. So
Right.
For us, what that means is, when should I drink? When I am my least stressed, most loved, most recovered, most adaptive self that can handle that additional stress.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that's, instead of saying I'm totally stressed, let me drink, we think is, wow, the opposite of that. I'm so in a good space, let me have half a bottle of wine. Right?
Right.
That's how we think about it. And suddenly when you apply that thinking, you're like, oh, hey, we are really agnostic about people's chemical dependencies, because we see it as like, dude, if no one has ever given you another model to manage your stress or to self-medicate or self-modulate, then you're going to just solve this problem on your own, the way we have for all these other things, right? My guy on the bed, getting his in the hospital, getting himself, that open heart surgery, had figured out how to self-medicate and organize and self-soothe and deal with his stress and his life, it blew up in his face, right?
Yeah.
And so suddenly what we know though is there are behaviors certainly that are more sustainable and healthier in the long run. And a long time ago, we began to say, look, you've got to come out of this unharmed at 1 rep over 1,000,000 reps. And part of that solution is understanding that you're not off the hook until you're 100. And
Right.
so if your short-term adaptation strategy to your stress is chemical dependent or sleep, like, you have to understand that that's not a long-term solution. So what we try to do is say, hey, look, what we think is these are better long-term solution strategies that allow us not to have this blow up, right, when we're suddenly 50 or a midlife crisis or 60 or 70 or
Right.
heart attack or something that we could have prevented with fundamentals.
So with a last bit of advice, I mean, for the adaptive community, those going through, maybe it's right now a trauma. It could be different for everyone. Everyone experiences trauma a little bit differently. I think the outlook on creating long-term habits that create effective change in the mind and the body. And the nice thing is you can create right now, you can feel good right now by doing self-maintenance, self-mobility, like with tools. It doesn't have to be like it might not make a change. It'll make a change immediately, but permanent change, it takes a long-term, consistent effort. And
neurons that fire together wire together, and neurons that fire apart wire apart. What we don't see is sometimes we don't think about pain as a behavior or depression as a behavior of neurons that have been wired together in a certain pattern. And so it's difficult to change well-reinforced sleep habits, well-reinforced depression or coping patterns and mechanisms. It's difficult, and it's a biologic process where we have to unmyelinate those systems and redevelop a new neural pathway. And thought processes are no different from physical behavior processes in terms of how the brain perceives it.
Right.
To your point, we like to say, hey, don't take our word for it. Just do it.
Just do it.
Just begin today with something that you can wrap your head around. It's a 5-minute walk, or you're going to roll quads for 5 minutes, or your chair, and you're going to hold a ball to your pec. Like, there doesn't matter. Whatever it is that you can do, get started now.
Take action.
And try to continue proving. And one of the things to understand is that this is never a game you're going to have dialed. So when we look at, there's a wonderful book called Finite and Infinite Games. And if you read that book, it's literally about how we can use sort of tenets of game theory to think about complex problems. It's not about gamifying everything, which I would hate. Like, I get a badge today because I rolled. No, that doesn't motivate me. But what I'll say is, as a useful construct out of that book is some games can be won. They have clear winners, clear losers, clear rules. They have start and finish. But some of these things we treat like games, like my health.
Sure.
And it's not. All you can do is play a better game. And an infinite game is a game that doesn't have clear rules. You're not even sure who's playing. You're not even sure what the rules are. But the goal is to play the best game that's available to you now. Like Tetris, you play Tetris and you got to put that crappy piece somewhere. And to keep everyone else in play. And I think when you start to think about that, then you're going to say, hey, I really fucked it up today, but tomorrow I'm going to be better. And I can play a better game this afternoon. And then all of a sudden, it's net positive in terms of aggregated sort of experience over time. And the body is, the reason we have a nervous system is to move ourselves through the environment and to sense the environment.
Right.
And when we start to put those inputs in, those sensations back, then it really is like what it's shorthand for we can change and rewire at any age. In the adaptive population, one of the dirtiest secrets is alcohol abuse, substance abuse. And what are those really shorthands for? I don't know how to make myself feel better. These are strategies of coping with anxiety and stress and depression. And so we're like, dude, of course you're drinking. Like, that makes total sense. That's what's available to you to make yourself feel better because now you're in a wheelchair. So there's no value statement there. But what we can say is, hey, that's going to work in the short term, but I guarantee it's not going to work in the long term.
Right.
And now here are some strategies that we think might also give you a better input.
Right. Well, Kelly, thank you so much for this advice. I know anyone listening that's going through, whether it's acute or they've been injured it's been a couple of years, they have a loved one. These are strategies for everyone because everyone has a brain and everyone has a body and they all can do maintenance and should be doing maintenance on it.
My 95-year-old grandma with terrible rheumatoid arthritis is in a wheelchair. And that makes her an adaptive athlete, right?
That makes her an adaptive athlete.
And that's 100% of our families. And so, I don't mean to offend anyone, but the amount of information and laboratory findings we have working with motivated people who self-identify as adaptive athletes, man, they have taught us how to handle trauma and stress and how to help with my mom when she falls and head trauma. And like, dude, it's the laboratory of we're all going to be on this continuum, 100% of us.
Well, the thing I'll leave everyone with is just the adaptive athlete. And I think their message, like, I just want to shout it to all of America because the ones that I have had an opportunity to work with and the ones that have come to your gym, Kelly, up at SFCF, it's like they've taken the action to do something and they're doing it and they're learning and they're teaching the coaches and the coaches are learning. And it's like a domino effect of goodness. And they've taken the effort. They've gone in a wheelchair or had a missing leg or, can't necessarily get their words out because they had a traumatic brain injury, but they're doing it. And everyone else in America who's sitting in their cushy chair with their cushy shoes needs to take note of that and do something.
Well, hopefully you come to the realization at a less of a costly price and buy-in, right?
Yes.
And but it's not for everyone. It's for everyone. And that's really shorthand for the fact that no one gets to escape that. You can't cheat your physiology.
No.
And it doesn't matter where your current condition is, you don't get to cheat your physiology. So first principles first. And look, and if you're listening to this and you're like, I'm not an adaptive athlete, and you have chronic pain, yes, you do, right? As long as there you have a sort of non-changing or temporarily changing or some system,
Right.
I have friends who, like, one of my best friends is a guy named Matt Vincent, who's a world champion Highland Games athlete, who has a knee that does not look like a knee. It looks like a garbage can, right? I love you, Matt. But dude, he is suffering under depression and chronic pain. He talks about it openly. It's debilitating. His knees swell. He can't walk. From the outside, you're like, wow, he's so handsome, and but dude, there's a guy going through 100% of the same, and not even remotely has done the work that any of my adaptive athletes have. Like, they're literally like, that guy needs to like harden up and get moving again, and and change his outlook. So what we're saying here is first principles first, and we always feel like we can improve the ball, and that may mean you come to see me for one problem and we end up talking about sleep hygiene. We know that's going to improve the ball, right? And getting some sun on your body again, getting your blood tests and looking at your vitamin B levels and vitamin D levels, that's going to improve the ball,
right?
Getting you to do breathe so you can unwind at night without having to drink 2 bottles of wine at night. That's one of the VPs that we know in our neighborhood who was trying to self-medicate so she could go to sleep at night, take 2 bottles of wine. So what we're seeing is that people are doing the best they can. We really try to reserve judgment because people are just coping in the only way they know how.
Thank you, Kelly, for this. It's been an honor. And I know I'm going to put in the show notes where people can find you, but if people have never heard of you, where can they find you?
We are at Mobility WOD, WOD, workout of the day. And believe it or not, starting in April, we'll become the Ready State.
That's right. That's your podcast.
It is, and will also become the whole shift. And the idea, I think, of the Ready State is that, look, we can get you ready to the best of our abilities and the best of your capacity today, because those things are always different and always variable. But, if you're only at 50% of 80%, that's pretty crappy. So let's give you your best available self today, psycho-emotionally, physically, activity ready. And I think we actually can feel a lot better as humans, and we can begin to sort of untangle this chronic pain web, this I feel disconnected web. I mean, it's all the same thing. It's all the same thing. People are what's most important. So that's where we are at Mobility WOD right now.
Thank you, Kelly. It's up to you now to do it. Okay. Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
girl.
Thank
Good
you.
to see you.